Merci du débat. The honourable member for Mississauga, Brampton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak in favour of Bill C-268, an act to amend the Criminal Code, minimum sentences for offences involving trafficking of persons under the age of 18 years. It provides for a minimum punishment of imprisonment for a term of 5 years of offences involving the trafficking of children. I'd like to begin my remarks by thanking the members, specifically the member from Kelowna St. Paul, for proposing this legislation and her tireless effort to address this very important issue. Mr. Speaker, this bill is of a personal interest to me because as a new father, I see the world through the eyes of my 23-month-old girl, Nanki Bains. And Mr. Speaker, I want to make sure that she or any other child is never victimized by the horrors of human trafficking. The trafficking of minors is an issue that by its very definition crosses borders, and this is something all Canadians can support regardless of their political affiliation. To many Canadians, human trafficking seems like an issue from another age. Just over 200 years ago, Canada and its Commonwealth partners led the Western world by banning the slave trade throughout the British Empire and actively using the power of the Royal Navy to prevent other countries, including the United States, from engaging in this despicable practice. Slavery itself was banned in 1833, and Canada became a beacon of hope for tens of thousands of slaves escaping the American South. But slavery was not regulated to history. It may no longer be practiced openly and certainly has no official sanction, but for the victims of human trafficking, it is still painfully very real. The International Labour Organization, an agency of the United Nations, estimates that there are 12.3 million adults and children in forced labour, bonded labour, and commercial sexual servitude presently. Think of that, Mr. Speaker. Every day, a population the size of Ontario labours as modern-day slaves. The United Nations estimates that the number grows each year with 700,000 people trafficked annually. Many of those trafficked are children who are very helpless by their nature and are unable to do anything about it. Yet many Canadians think that this is a problem that doesn't pertain to us, that doesn't reach our shores, something that the government should address through our foreign policy and international development efforts. But human trafficking is a Canadian problem as well as a global problem. The U.S. State Department, in a report from June of this year, refers to Canada, and I quote, a source, transit, and destination country for men, women, and children trafficked for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor. This is a wake-up call, Mr. Speaker. Many of these people come from Asia and Eastern Europe, but victims also come from Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. More disturbingly, the report says, and I quote, Canadian women and girls, many of whom are Aboriginal, are trafficked internally for commercial sexual exploitation. For example, there was a case of a man from Victoria who allegedly lured a 14-year-old girl from a BC interior and then forced her into prostitution and beat her. Last year, in Montreal, another man trafficked a 17-year-old and procured 3 others for the purposes of prostitution. And even in my own backyard, in Brampton, there was a case of a man convicted of human trafficking and living off a prostitution of a 15-year-old homeless girl who was sold in Toronto. And during his trial, he revealed that he made $360,000 for selling 2 young girls for sex. Human trafficking exists in our communities. It affects our children. So what can we do? How can we help? Last year, a report of the Canada-United States consultation in preparation for the World Congress III against sexual exploitation of children and adolescents pointed out inconsistencies with our approach to addressing trafficking of children. The report points out that, and I quote, under Canadian law, procuring a child is punished more severely than trafficking a child, unquote. The report goes on to recommend that Canada must amend the criminal code to provide a mandatory minimum penalty for child trafficking. And I believe Bill C-268 does just that. But just like the banning of the slave trade did not completely remove the scourge of slavery, I do not expect that this bill alone will tackle the problem. It is an important first step, but there is much more that can be and should be done. One of the major concerns is the issue of victims' rights compared to the larger struggle against the traffickers. Recognizing trafficked persons as victims of crime rather than as criminals themselves is important if we would uncover trafficking networks and bringing I apologize, I can't pronounce the word right now, bringing them to justice. This has been difficult because traditionally trafficked persons have been treated as illegal immigrants and often deported. A frequently cited gap in victim protection scheme is the lack of an early identification procedure for victims of trafficking. Currently, there is no formal process for the identification of trafficked persons, which is a prerequisite for providing victim protection. Immigration and law enforcement officials must be given the tools to recognize trafficked persons and know when trafficking has occurred. How else can we expect these new laws to be meaningfully applied? Another gap that exists involves the services offered to trafficked persons. These include protection services, shelter, health services, long-term counseling, and economic services. The Government of Canada currently does not have a national approach to services for trafficked persons, and since many of these services are offered at the provincial level, they exist in uneven levels. What we need is a national strategy to address human trafficking. The government has an opportunity here to use the goodwill in the House to do the right thing and make sure that we address this issue in a coordinated fashion from coast to coast. Mr. Speaker, even those who are happy to return home face a lack of support for safe return. Trafficked persons can face a wide variety of emotional and physical obstacles, ranging from ostracism in the home community, threats from traffickers, and a repeat of the same conditions of poverty that lead them to leave in the first place. We need to work with the international community to address these issues and create an organized process to facilitate safe return and reintegration. These aren't simple issues. They involve legislative and regulatory changes. They involve the cooperation with all levels of government, NGOs, and community groups. They involve decisive leadership, not just by Canada, but by the entire international community. It is important that we as parliamentarians continue to fight for the victims of trafficking and that we work with all the relevant stakeholders to remove this horrible, tragic situation. William Wilberforce, the British parliamentarian who led the movement to abolish the slave trade, once said, and I quote, "Let everyone regulate his conduct by the golden rule of doing to others as in similar circumstances we would have them to do to us, and the path of duty will be clear before him," unquote. Mr. Speaker, our path of duty is clear, and this bill is another step in a journey towards a world where human trafficking is a distant memory. Thank you very much.